They laughed when I hit the water, not gasped or asked if I was all right, but laughed. The kind of laugh that hides behind a forced smile. The kind that doesn't invite comfort, but rather distance. A laugh that says, "This is funny, and you're the joke." I can still hear it, ringing in my ears as if the summer heat wasn't supposed to sting quite that much, as if the sun were meant to warm me and not mock me while I shivered, dripping wet in front of my own family. I was 81 years old, standing there in a soaking dress and shoes that weighed down my feet, the water running cold through my clothes, the skin of my arms prickling from the unexpected chill. They laughed because it was a joke, or so I was told later. The granddaughter's eyes gleamed with a mixture of mischief and something colder, something that felt like a test to see if I would crack. But I didn't crack. I only stood there, swallowing the sudden tightness in my throat, the sharp sting behind my eyes that wasn't tears, but something heavier. Disbelief and an aching sense of invisibility. That day, at my daughter's house, I realized something I hadn't dared to admit before. I was becoming invisible to the people I loved most. I live now in a modest condo in Scottsdale, Arizona. The kind of place that hums quietly with the sounds of neighbors who don't know your name and the occasional wind ruffling the brittle leaves of a potted plant on the balcony. It's peaceful, predictable, and above all, safe. But that weekend, I was somewhere else. At my daughter's, surrounded by family, watching the laughter circle and twist around me like a thin veil of smoke, never quite touching, never quite including. The poolside was bright and alive with the chatter of children splashing, the clinking of glasses, and the warm smell of sunscreen mixed with the faint aroma of barbecued meat. It should have been a celebration, but it felt like a trial. There was an unspoken tension beneath the surface, a quiet undercurrent of impatience and dismissiveness that I tried to ignore but could not. My granddaughter, once a shy little girl who used to sit on my lap and ask me to tell stories, had changed. The girl who had painted my nails in clumsy strokes and whispered secrets was now a teenager with sharp eyes and sharper words. I remember the moment clearly. We were gathered around the pool, talking about trivial things, the weather, the new show she was watching, her school projects, when she suddenly reached out and pushed me. Just like that, a quick shove that sent me stumbling backward and into the water. The splash was loud, shocking, and all eyes turned to me, waiting for my reaction. But what came was silence, a pause filled only with the sound of water dripping from my hair and dress. The laughter came then, but it was hollow, shared mostly between my granddaughter and the others who didn't know what to say or do. No one handed me a towel. No one offered a hand to help me out. I pulled myself from the water, the wet fabric clinging to my skin, cold and uncomfortable. I was an old woman who had just been pushed into a pool, and I was standing there alone, shivering in the heat of a sunny afternoon. The air around me seemed to grow thick with something I could not name. Embarrassment, anger, sorrow. A mixture that twisted in my gut and settled heavy on my chest. I wanted to speak, to ask why, to demand respect, but my voice caught in my throat, and all I could do was step away and wrap myself in the quiet that no one else seemed to notice. They say families are meant to be our safe havens, the places where we are known and loved without condition. But sometimes they become arenas where we are tested and found wanting, where the ties that bind feel more like chains than comfort. I thought I had been a good grandmother, a steady presence in their lives. I had baked cookies for birthdays, attended school recitals, listened to whispered worries in the dark hours of sleepless nights. Yet in that moment, pushed into the pool and left to dry, I saw that my place in their lives was uncertain, conditional, fragile. I was no longer the grandmother who was cherished and included, but someone to be tolerated or dismissed, a fixture easily moved aside. It wasn't just the push into the pool, though that was the sharpest cut. It was the way everyone moved on afterward, as if nothing had happened, as if I were merely a piece of furniture in the yard, wet and out of place, but easily ignored. My daughter spoke about me in tones that were too loud, words meant for the other adults, not for my ears. "Mom's a bit slow these days," she said once, a phrase that felt like a verdict and a sentence all at once. My granddaughter avoided looking at me, her eyes flickering away like they feared what she might see there. A woman growing smaller, fading away. The youngest cousins darted around, laughing and splashing, their joy a reminder of the vitality I was slowly losing in their eyes. I retreated to the guest room, the one they had prepared for me with neat towels and a bottle of lotion that smelled faintly of lavender. My clothes were damp, and I sat on the edge of the bed, the fabric clinging to my legs as if mocking my vulnerability. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant murmur of voices downstairs. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, trying to steady the storm of emotions that threatened to spill over. For a moment, I felt entirely alone, not just in that room, but in the world they inhabited without me. Later, when the sun began to dip and the sky turned a soft shade of pink, I sat by the window and watched the family gather again by the pool. The water sparkled, reflecting the fading light, a shimmering surface that concealed the fractures beneath. I thought of all the years I had lived, all the love I had given, and the sudden realization that perhaps love alone was not enough to hold us together. I thought of my own mother, long gone now, who had told me that sometimes the hardest part of growing older was being seen as less, as someone whose story was almost over before it was fully told. I felt that truth settle around me like a weight, but even in that heaviness, there was a flicker of something else. A quiet fire, a stubborn refusal to be erased. I had lived through decades of change, loss, and renewal, and I was not yet ready to disappear. The cold water in my clothes was a sharp reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still feeling. I would not let their laughter define me or their silence push me into the shadows. This was not the end of my story, only a harsh chapter, and I would find my way through it. That night, as the house settled into sleep and the world outside grew still, I lay awake thinking about the granddaughter who had pushed me, the daughter who had whispered about my slowing down, and the family that had gathered around, pretending everything was fine. I thought about the years behind me, filled with moments both joyful and painful, and the years ahead, uncertain but mine to claim. I thought about the pool, the water, the laughter that had cut so deep, and I realized that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from fighting back in the moment, but from choosing when and how to rise again. I am still here. I am still standing. And I am ready to tell the story no one asked to hear, to speak the truth behind the laughter, to carve out a space for myself in a world that too often tries to forget us. This is my voice now, soft but steady, a grandmother's voice that carries the weight of love and loss, resilience and quiet defiance. And it begins with the memory of that day by the pool, the laughter that was not kind, and the decision I made not to disappear. The moment that pushed me into a new reality was not just the laughter by the pool. It was what came after. The quiet dismissal that told me louder than words ever could that I was no longer welcome in the place I had once called family. After I had clumsily climbed out of the water, my dress heavy and soaked, my shoes squelching with each step, I looked around for something, anything, that might offer comfort or at least acknowledgement. But there was only the sharp edge of silence and the shifting of eyes away from mine. No one offered a towel. No one asked if I was cold or hurt, as if the incident were merely a brief interruption to their afternoon, and I was a problem to be solved by ignoring. My daughter glanced my way, her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable. She did not speak. My granddaughter, who had pushed me, hovered near the poolside chairs, her phone in hand, scrolling as if nothing had happened, her shoulders tight with the energy of someone who knew she had gotten away with something and was not sorry. The adults exchanged looks, subtle but unmistakable, as if silently agreeing that it was best not to make a fuss over an old woman who might only embarrass them further. That was the moment I understood what the laughter really meant. It wasn't amusement. It was a declaration of my place within the family. On the outside, looking in, a figure to be endured rather than embraced. I had always thought that family was where we found our refuge, where love was unconditional and memories formed a bridge across generations. But that day, in the bright sunlight reflecting off the pool's surface, I saw that family could also be a battleground, a place where respect could wither quietly and where invisibility was the cruelest punishment. I sat down on the edge of the patio, my wet clothes clinging to me, the cold seeping into my bones, and for the first time in many years, I felt like a stranger in my own story. The hours that followed were a strange haze of half-hearted apologies and conversations that excluded me. My daughter busied herself with preparations for dinner, her voice raised just enough for the adults to hear as she spoke to her husband and their friends, but carefully lowered whenever I entered the room. There was a phrase I heard often that evening, repeated like a refrain. "Mom's not quite herself these days," or "She's been a bit forgetful lately." It was said with the kind of casual concern that stings deeper than anger. It was a way of saying that I was slipping away, that my place was shrinking with every passing day, and that my presence was becoming more of a burden than a blessing. I caught my granddaughter watching me from across the room, her eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of impatience flashing behind her carefully maintained facade of politeness. She was no longer the little girl who had once clung to my hand with trust and affection. She was someone different now, someone I barely recognized, someone who measured me against an invisible standard I could never meet. That night, as the house settled into quiet, I retreated to the guest room that had been prepared for me. It was a small, neat space, painted a soft beige with a window overlooking the backyard. The bed was made with crisp white linens, and a small lamp cast a warm glow over the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, my wet dress still heavy around my legs, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The laughter, the push, the cold water. It all seemed like a cruel joke played out in slow motion, a moment of humiliation that cut deeper because it was witnessed and ignored. I thought about the years I had spent nurturing this family, the meals cooked, the birthdays celebrated, the countless drives to school and doctor's appointments. I thought about the sacrifices made quietly, the moments of loneliness hidden beneath smiles and reassurances. And now I was the punchline of a joke that no one wanted to explain. The old woman who was too slow, too fragile, too much trouble. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay awake, listening to the soft creaks of the house settling, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and the muffled voices of my daughter and son-in-law downstairs. I wondered if they ever saw me, really saw me, or if I was just a shadow on the edge of their lives, a reminder of a past that was best left undisturbed. I thought about the future, about what it meant to grow old and be invisible, to be pushed aside like an unwanted guest. The ache in my limbs was nothing compared to the ache in my heart, the quiet sorrow of being left behind by the people who should have been my refuge. The next morning brought no relief. At breakfast, the air was thick with unspoken tensions. My granddaughter sat across from me, her eyes fixed on her phone, barely acknowledging my presence. When she did speak, it was with a tone that bordered on condescension. "You're not mad, are you, Grandma? It was just a joke." The words were light, but the implication was heavy, that my feelings were not to be taken seriously, that my discomfort was an overreaction to a harmless prank. I wanted to tell her that it was not the push itself, but the laughter, the silence, and the absence of care that hurt the most. That it was not about anger, but about being seen and valued. But the words caught in my throat once again, and I only nodded silently. As the day wore on, the family busied themselves with plans and distractions, leaving me increasingly alone. I wandered through the rooms of the house, touching surfaces that felt foreign under my fingers, sitting in chairs that were not mine, and looking out windows that framed a world I no longer belonged to. The house was filled with voices and laughter, but it was not my home. I felt like a visitor in a place that had once been mine, a guest in a story where I no longer held the lead role. The realization was painful and profound. The family I had built and nurtured was slipping away, not with a dramatic blow, but with quiet neglect and subtle erasure. In the afternoon, I found myself drawn back to the pool, the scene of the moment that had changed everything. The water was still, reflecting the clear sky above, and I stood at the edge, the memories flooding back. The little hands that once held mine, the laughter that was warm and genuine, the stories shared in the fading light of summer evenings. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different world altogether. I reached out and touched the surface of the water, feeling its coolness seep into my skin, and I made a silent promise to myself. I would not be invisible. I would not disappear quietly into the background of their lives. I was still here, I was still whole, and I would find a way to reclaim my place, even if it meant standing alone. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, I sat quietly, watching the faces around the table, seeing the familiar lines and expressions, but also the distance that had grown between us. I thought about the years of love and sacrifice that had brought me to this moment, about the fragile threads of connection that still held us together, and about the strength I would need to hold on. The laughter from earlier echoed in my mind, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of what could still be found. I knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, that there would be moments of pain and loneliness, but I also knew that I was ready to face them. Because in the end, the most important thing was to be seen, not as a joke, not as a burden, but as a woman with a story worth telling and a life worth living. After the cold shock of the pool and the lingering sting of that dismissive laughter, the days that followed stretched out in a slow, creeping silence that was harder to bear than any harsh word or sudden blow. The family gathered as usual, their routines humming quietly around me, but I felt increasingly adrift, as if I were a ghost haunting the edges of their lives rather than a grandmother with a place at the table. My wet clothes had dried on the guest room chair, stiff and slightly musty, and I kept avoiding looking at them, as though their presence was a cruel reminder of a moment I wished I could erase. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, but it was a soundtrack I no longer belonged to. It was a symphony, played in a language I could no longer understand. I found myself retreating more and more into the shadows of the rooms, sitting quietly with a book I wasn't reading, or wandering the garden paths where the sunlight filtered softly through the leaves, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and freshly cut grass. The shift was subtle, but relentless. It began with the small things, the way my suggestions were politely acknowledged but never acted upon, the way my presence was tolerated but never really welcomed. At breakfast one morning, I offered to help clear the table, but my daughter waved me off with a quick, distracted smile, her attention fixed on her phone. "Go relax, Mom," she said. "We've got it covered." The words sounded kind, but they felt like a gentle shove, a reminder that I was no longer needed in the busy, bustling world they inhabited. I retreated to the porch, where the sun warmed the wooden bench and the distant hum of traffic created a soothing backdrop. Sitting there, I realized how much the landscape of my life had changed, from being a central figure in family celebrations and everyday moments to becoming an afterthought, a shadow fading into the background. The grandchildren, once eager to hear my stories and play in my lap, now glanced at me with something close to impatience, as if I were an old book they had outgrown. My granddaughter, the same one who had pushed me into the pool, avoided eye contact with practiced skill, her face set in the kind of polite neutrality that disguised a deeper indifference. She no longer asked for my help with homework or sought my advice on the latest drama at school. Instead, she was absorbed in her phone, her world shrinking into the glowing screen, a place where I had no access or influence. I watched her sometimes, wondering when the warmth had gone out of her eyes, when the girl who once whispered secrets and dreams had been replaced by this distant, guarded teenager. The subtle erasure extended beyond words and glances. It was in the way my daughter rearranged the living room furniture without consulting me, placing the photo albums and scrapbooks on high shelves where I could not reach. It was in the way the family calendar, once carefully maintained with birthdays, anniversaries, and visits, no longer included my name or plans. I was not forgotten entirely. That would have been too cruel. But I was reduced to a footnote, a brief mention in the margins of their lives. I felt the slow tightening of a noose made not of ropes, but of silence, avoidance, and neglect. It was a form of violence that carried no bruises, but left deep, invisible scars. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter on the phone, her voice low and strained. "She's just not herself," she said, and I knew they were talking about me. It was the phrase that had become the explanation for everything. My slow movements, my forgetfulness, my growing withdrawal. They said it as if it were a medical diagnosis, a condition to be managed rather than a woman to be understood and loved. I was tired of being defined by my limitations, tired of being the subject of whispered conversations that never included me. I longed to speak up, to remind them of who I was, a woman who had raised children, built a home, and carried a family through storms both literal and figurative. But the words caught in my throat, and I remained silent, retreating further into myself. At night, in the quiet darkness of the guest room, I found myself replaying moments from my life, memories that seemed distant and fragile, like faded photographs. I thought about the birthdays I had celebrated with homemade cakes, the school plays I had attended, the countless meals prepared with love and care. I remembered the lullabies sung softly in the dark, the hands held tightly through difficult times, the laughter shared under summer skies. Those memories were a lifeline, a reminder of a time when I was not invisible, when I mattered deeply and unequivocally. But as I held on to them, I also felt the weight of their absence, the ache of being overlooked and dismissed. In the days that followed, I began to notice the ways in which my autonomy was quietly undermined. My opinions were brushed aside with phrases like, "We'll handle it," or "Let the adults take care of this." Invitations to family gatherings came less frequently, often with polite but firm suggestions that I take it easy or don't worry about it. The subtle message was clear. I was to be seen but not heard, present but not involved. I understood that this was not born of malice, but of a desire to protect and manage, to shield me from what they perceived as challenges beyond my capacity. Yet in their well-intentioned control, they were erasing the very essence of who I was. One afternoon, as I sat quietly in the corner of the living room, I caught sight of a photo album on the coffee table. It was open to pictures of my granddaughter, vibrant and smiling, surrounded by friends and school events I had never been invited to. I traced the edges of the photographs with my finger, feeling a pang of loss for moments I had missed and for a relationship that seemed to be slipping away. I realized then that my presence in their lives was becoming more symbolic than real, a gesture of respect rather than a connection of hearts. It was as if I were a character in a play whose lines had been forgotten, whose role had diminished to that of a silent observer. Despite the growing distance, I refused to be entirely erased. I began to hold on to small acts of resistance, moments where I could assert my presence and remind myself of my worth. I took long walks around the neighborhood, breathing in the scent of blooming flowers and feeling the sun warm my face. I returned to old hobbies, dusting off the knitting needles and the well-worn recipe books that had once been a source of comfort and pride. I wrote letters to friends I had lost touch with, reconnecting with a world beyond the confines of family dynamics. These small acts became a quiet rebellion, a way to claim my space and my identity in a life that was rapidly changing. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a stirring of something I had thought long gone: hope. It was fragile and tentative, like the first buds of spring after a harsh winter, but it was there. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that the subtle erosion of my place in the family was a wound that would take time to heal. But I also knew that I had the strength to endure, to rebuild, and to find new ways to be seen and heard. The laughter by the pool had been a painful beginning, but it was also a catalyst, a turning point that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I was no longer the woman who could be pushed aside without consequence. I was a grandmother who had weathered storms, who carried scars both visible and hidden, and who was ready to reclaim her story on her own terms. The journey was just beginning, and though it was uncertain and fraught with challenges, it was mine to take. And so I held my head a little higher, breathed a little deeper, and stepped forward into the unknown, carrying with me the quiet fire of resilience and the enduring hope of a life still unfolding. It was during one of those long, quiet afternoons in the guest room that I first felt the stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. A flicker of agency, a whisper of reclaiming my own story. The air was still, the soft hum of the house around me a gentle reminder that life continued outside my cocoon of uncertainty and retreat. I sat by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden, where the flowers bloomed, oblivious to the dramas of human hearts. It was a small moment, barely noticeable, but within it was the seed of change. I realized that if I was to find a way back to myself, I would have to stop waiting for others to recognize my worth and begin to recognize it myself. That realization was not sudden or dramatic. It did not come with a lightning strike or a declaration. Instead, it was a quiet turning inward, a soft folding of pain into purpose. I began to reach for the things I had once loved but had set aside. The worn leather-bound journal that had gathered dust on the shelf, the pen that fit so comfortably in my hand, the gentle act of putting thoughts to paper. Writing had always been a refuge, a place where I could untangle the knots of emotion and find clarity in the chaos. But after my husband died and the family demands grew heavier, I had abandoned it, convinced there was no time or energy left for such luxuries. Now, with time stretched out before me like an empty canvas, I picked up the pen again. At first the words came haltingly, a trickle of memories, feelings, and reflections. I wrote about the laughter by the pool and the coldness that followed, about the shifting dynamics within the family, and the loneliness that crept in like an uninvited guest. But as the days passed, the writing grew steadier, more confident. It became a dialogue with myself, a way to name the pain without letting it define me. I found myself writing not just about loss, but about hope, about the possibility of carving out a new place in the world, a space where I could be seen and heard on my own terms. Alongside the writing, I began to take small but deliberate steps to reclaim my autonomy. I arranged to meet with a local women's group, a community of older women who gathered weekly to share stories, skills, and support. It was a nervous first step, walking into a room full of strangers, but the warmth of their welcome surprised me. They did not see me as a relic of the past or a burden to be managed. They saw me as a woman with a lifetime of experiences and a voice worth listening to. Those meetings became a sanctuary, a place where I could speak without hesitation and listen without judgment. I discovered that I was not alone in feeling sidelined, that many women carried their own stories of invisibility and quiet resilience. In the mornings, I took to walking the neighborhood, letting the rhythm of my steps ground me in the present. I found comfort in the changing seasons, the scent of earth after rain, the play of light through the branches. These walks were meditative, a moving prayer of sorts, a way to reconnect with a world that often seemed to pass me by. Sometimes I stopped by a small park bench to rest and watch the world go by. Children playing, couples strolling hand in hand, old friends sharing laughter on a nearby porch. I felt the threads of connection weaving slowly back into the fabric of my life, fragile but growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, I found myself drawn to a second-hand bookstore that sat tucked away on a quiet street corner. The windows were dusty, the shelves crowded with worn volumes, and the air smelled of paper and time. Inside, the owner, a kind woman with spectacles perched on the tip of her nose, greeted me with a gentle smile. I spent hours browsing through the books, running my fingers over the spines, losing myself in stories that spanned generations and continents. The bookstore became a small refuge, a place where I could feed my curiosity and reclaim the joy of discovery. I purchased a notebook, its cover soft and inviting, and a collection of poetry that spoke to the enduring human spirit. Back at the guest room, I began to read aloud the poems I had found, savoring the cadence of the words and the way they seemed to echo my own journey. There was a particular verse that lingered in my mind. There are women who rise not from fire, but from forgetting who told them they couldn't. Those lines resonated deeply, a quiet anthem for the road I was beginning to travel. I repeated them to myself like a mantra, letting the strength of the words seep into my bones. Slowly, I started to notice changes in how I saw myself and how others responded to me. The careful way I carried myself, the deliberate kindness in my smile, the spark in my eyes when I spoke of books or memories. These were small but significant markers of a renewed sense of self. My daughter noticed too, though she did not say so directly. One evening, as we sat together in the kitchen, she remarked softly, "You seem different these days, Mom." I nodded, feeling the truth of the statement deep within. I was different. I was no longer waiting to be rescued or acknowledged. I was beginning to stand on my own. The most profound change, however, came from within. I no longer defined myself by the roles others assigned me. The grandmother who was to be protected and managed, the older woman whose opinions were politely dismissed. Instead, I embraced the fullness of who I was. A woman with a past, rich in love and struggle, with a present shaped by choice and courage, and with a future still unwritten, but full of possibility. The act of writing, the walks, the community, and the books became the scaffolding upon which I rebuilt my identity, brick by brick. In this shift, I found a quiet power that was both humbling and exhilarating. It was not the kind of power that demands attention or asserts dominance, but the kind that comes from self-awareness and acceptance. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me or by the roles I had played for others. I was defined by my own voice, my own story, and my own will to live fully and authentically. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the garden was bathed in golden light, I stood by the window and looked out at the world with new eyes. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, the birds sang their evening songs, and the promise of a new chapter unfolded quietly before me. I felt a deep sense of peace, not because the past had been erased, but because I had found the strength to carry it with me without being weighed down. I was ready to step forward, to embrace whatever came next, with grace and resolve. This was the turning point, the moment when the story shifted from one of loss and invisibility to one of awakening and agency. It was the beginning of a journey not just back to myself, but toward a future I would shape with intention and courage. The poolside laughter, the cold water, and the silence had been painful lessons, but they had also been the catalyst for a transformation that was both deeply personal and profoundly liberating. I was no longer waiting for others to see me. I was beginning to see myself, clearly, compassionately, and with a fierce determination to live fully on my own terms. The days that followed the quiet turning of my own heart were not simple or serene. If the shift within me was a delicate bud unfurling, the world outside seemed determined to challenge every fragile petal, to test the limits of my newfound resolve. The family I had once known, or thought I knew, was still there, but the distance between us had grown in ways both visible and unseen. It was in the subtle looks exchanged across the room, the barely concealed sighs when I asked questions, and in the occasional words that seemed carefully chosen to remind me of the boundaries I was not supposed to cross. I found myself navigating a complex landscape where love and rejection danced in a delicate, often painful balance. One afternoon, as I sat quietly in the kitchen, the postman delivered a letter that changed the tone of everything. It was from my granddaughter, the same girl who had pushed me into the pool weeks before. The envelope was thick, the handwriting familiar yet hesitant, as if she was reaching out with trembling hands across a chasm neither of us fully understood. I held the letter carefully, feeling the weight of unspoken words and unshed tears. When I opened it, the page inside was filled with a mixture of apology, confusion, and a tentative desire to reconnect. She wrote about the pressure she felt at school, the awkwardness of growing up, and how she hadn't meant to hurt me, that pushing me was a moment of frustration taken too far. She asked if we could talk, if I could forgive her. The words stirred a complicated mix of emotions within me: sadness, longing, and a cautious hope that perhaps the rift between us was not unbridgeable. But the letter was also a reminder of how far I had come and how much I still needed to protect myself. I knew that forgiveness was not a simple gift to be given lightly, nor was it a surrender of my dignity or boundaries. It was a process, one that required time and mutual respect. I wrote back carefully, choosing my words with the precision of a woman who had learned the value of measured speech. I told her that I was willing to listen when she was ready to speak with honesty and kindness, that I was not angry but needed time to heal. I placed the letter in an envelope and sent it, feeling both the pain of distance and the fragile thread of connection. That evening, the family gathered for dinner, and I sensed the undercurrent of tension, as if the letter's arrival had stirred old currents beneath the calm surface. My daughter, who had always been the family's peacemaker, looked at me with a mixture of concern and frustration. She spoke softly, urging me to let go of the past and move forward with the family. But her words felt like a demand rather than an invitation, a reminder that the reconciliation I sought was to be on their terms. I nodded politely, but inside, I held firm to the knowledge that healing could not be rushed or forced. The days that followed brought new challenges. The granddaughter's behavior fluctuated between moments of warmth and sharp withdrawal, leaving me uncertain of where I stood. There were times when she would sit beside me, sharing stories of school or music with a tentative smile, and other times when she would turn away, her eyes avoiding mine, as if afraid of what she might see reflected back. It was a fragile dance of connection and distance, a reminder that relationships, especially those strained by hurt, are never linear or predictable. Amid this personal turbulence, the family's dynamics continued to evolve in ways that tested my resolve. My daughter and son-in-law often spoke in hushed tones about making decisions for the good of everyone, decisions that frequently seemed to exclude my voice or perspective. There were discussions about medical appointments, financial matters, and social events where I was only informed after plans had been made. It was as if I had become a guest in my own life, a spectator rather than a participant. The subtle but persistent sidelining was a form of emotional violence that wore on me, eroding my confidence even as I fought to maintain my dignity. One afternoon, the granddaughter's friends came over for a gathering, filling the house with youthful energy and laughter that sometimes felt like a barrier rather than a bridge. I watched from the sidelines as they danced and joked, feeling both nostalgia for my own youth and the pang of exclusion. The granddaughter approached me briefly, her face flushed with the excitement of adolescence, and whispered a tentative "thank you" for the quiet listening ear I had offered. It was a small moment of connection, a flicker of light in the complicated tapestry of our relationship. However, the next day brought a confrontation that shook the fragile peace I had begun to build. During a family meeting, tensions flared over decisions regarding my care and living arrangements. My daughter expressed concerns about my safety and well-being, suggesting that I might be better off in a more supervised environment. The granddaughter's eyes flashed with frustration, and she accused me of making things difficult and not understanding how things have changed. the room filled with raised voices and defensive statements, a clash of love, fear, and misunderstanding. I stood firm, speaking calmly but resolutely, asserting my right to autonomy and respect. It was a difficult moment, but one that reaffirmed my commitment to being seen and heard. As the week wore on, I found solace in the new routines I had established for myself. The writing continued to be a refuge, a place where I could process the complexities of my emotions and chart a path forward. I reconnected with friends from my women's group, whose stories of resilience and courage provided comfort and inspiration. The walks in the neighborhood became moments of meditation, where I could breathe deeply and ground myself in the present. The bookstore remained a sanctuary, its shelves a testament to the enduring power of stories to heal and transform. One afternoon, a neighbor from the community center invited me to a small gathering of local artists and writers. I hesitated but accepted, stepping into a world that was unfamiliar, yet welcoming. The conversations were rich and varied, filled with laughter, thoughtful debate, and shared experiences. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing snippets of my journey and listening to the journeys of others. It was a reminder that life is not defined by a single chapter, but by the ongoing narrative we create, page by page. Throughout this second escalation, I grappled with the tension between vulnerability and strength, between the desire for connection and the need for boundaries. I learned that healing is rarely linear, that progress often comes with setbacks, and that true resilience is found not in perfection, but in the courage to continue despite uncertainty. The laughter by the pool had marked a painful beginning, but it also set in motion a journey of awakening and empowerment. I understood more deeply than ever that the relationships I sought to mend required patience, honesty, and mutual respect. I was no longer willing to be a passive participant in a story written by others. I was ready to claim my voice, to speak my truth, and to live a life that honored both my past and my present. The challenges were many, the path uncertain, but the fire within me burned steadily, a beacon guiding me through the complexities of family and self. In the quiet moments before sleep, I reflected on the journey so far. The pain, the growth, the unexpected moments of grace. I knew that the road ahead would continue to test me, but I also knew that I was not alone. The support of new friends, the tentative bridges with my granddaughter, and the inner strength I was cultivating all combined to create a foundation upon which I could stand tall. This was the second escalation, a crucible that forged resilience from hardship and clarity from confusion. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, flawed, imperfect, but persistent. And as I closed my eyes each night, I carried with me the quiet hope that, in time, healing would come not only for me, but for all of us. The moment of reckoning came quietly, without fanfare or spectacle, but with a clarity that cut through the fog of years and pain like a sharp beam of light. It was not a sudden confrontation or a dramatic declaration, but a deliberate act, measured and resolute, born from the slow forging of my own strength and the deep understanding that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. I had spent weeks weaving my way through the tangled web of family dynamics, the fragile attempts at reconciliation, and the quiet betrayals that had accumulated like dust on the corners of my heart. And now it was time to lay down a boundary that was both final and necessary, a clear statement that I was no longer willing to be diminished or controlled. The day began like many others, the sun casting soft golden light through the kitchen window as I sat with my morning tea, the warmth seeping into my hands and grounding me in the present. There was a letter waiting for me on the table, its familiar handwriting instantly recognizable. It was from my daughter, a carefully worded plea for understanding and cooperation, a request for me to consider next steps regarding my living situation and care. The words were polite, but the message was clear. They wanted to take control, to decide what was best for me without truly consulting me. I folded the letter slowly, feeling a surge of emotions: frustration, sadness, and beneath it all, a fierce determination. This would be the moment I reclaimed my agency. I drafted a letter in response, not to my daughter or granddaughter this time, but to the lawyer they had sent to act as their intermediary. It was a letter that needed to be firm, clear, and unequivocal. I wrote with a steady hand, each word chosen to convey not anger, but resolve. I stated that I was of sound mind, living safely and independently, and that any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I informed them that I had retained local legal counsel and that I expected my wishes to be respected. The letter was not just a document. It was a declaration of my dignity, a shield against the subtle encroachments that had threatened to erode my autonomy. The act of sending that letter was both terrifying and liberating. I remember standing at the post office, the weight of the envelope in my hand, feeling the eyes of strangers on me as if they could sense the significance of the moment. When I dropped the letter into the mailbox, there was a quiet satisfaction, a sense that I had taken back a piece of myself that had been lost or forgotten. It was an irreversible step, one that marked the end of a chapter defined by passive acceptance and the beginning of one shaped by active self-determination. That evening, the house was filled with an uneasy silence. The family had gathered for dinner, and I could feel the tension like a taut wire stretched between us. My daughter's eyes searched mine, a mixture of hurt and frustration flickering in their depths. The granddaughter sat across the table, her posture stiff, the usual bravado replaced by a wary caution. I met their gazes steadily, no longer shrinking into the shadows, but standing firmly in the light of my own truth. I spoke calmly, explaining that I was not angry, that my actions were not meant to punish, but to protect the life I had fought to preserve. I told them that I loved them, but that love required respect and recognition of my choices. There was no dramatic reconciliation that night, no sweeping declarations of forgiveness or understanding. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a grudging acknowledgement that the woman they had known, or thought they knew, was still here, whole and unbroken. The conversations that followed were tentative, careful, and often incomplete, but they laid the groundwork for a new kind of relationship, one where boundaries were respected and voices were heard. In the days that followed, I continued to build my life on this new foundation. I deepened my involvement with the women's group, finding strength in shared stories and mutual support. I returned to the bookstore regularly, losing myself in the world of words and ideas, feeding a hunger that had long been neglected. I maintained the small rituals that gave my days shape and meaning: morning walks, journaling, quiet moments of reflection. These practices became acts of resistance and renewal, affirmations of my right to live fully and authentically. The granddaughter reached out again, this time with a tentative phone call. Her voice was softer, more vulnerable than before, and she spoke of her own struggles and regrets. We talked for a long time, not about the past, but about the possibility of moving forward, slowly and on our own terms. It was not a perfect or easy connection, but it was real, and that was enough. One afternoon, as I stood by the window watching the garden bloom, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The laughter by the pool, the cold water, the silences and the small acts of kindness and defiance, they were all threads woven into the fabric of my story. I realized that the true climax of my journey was not a single moment of triumph, but the accumulation of countless moments of courage, resilience, and grace. It was the quiet power of a woman who refused to be erased, who reclaimed her voice and her life against the odds. The house smelled of fresh bread and lavender as I prepared a simple meal for myself. The evening light cast long shadows across the floor, and I felt a deep sense of peace, not because everything was resolved, but because I had found a way to live with the complexities and contradictions of love and family. I was no longer waiting for permission to exist fully. I was giving myself that permission every day. This was the climax. Not a dramatic confrontation or a final battle, but a profound act of self-possession and dignity. It was the moment when I stopped shrinking and started expanding, when I embraced my worth and refused to be diminished by the fears and expectations of others. It was a turning point that marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with possibility, connection, and a deep, abiding sense of self. As I closed the kitchen window and settled into my chair with a book in hand, I knew that the road ahead would have its challenges. There would be moments of doubt and loneliness, of conflict and misunderstanding. But I also knew that I was no longer alone, that I had the strength and the support to face whatever came next. The laughter by the pool would always echo in my memory, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been found. But it was no longer a source of pain. It was a catalyst for transformation, a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring light of the human spirit. I was ready to live the rest of my life on my own terms with courage, grace, and the quiet joy of knowing that I was enough, just as I am. The days after the letter, after the quiet reclaiming of my dignity, unfolded with a slow and steady rhythm that was both unfamiliar and deeply comforting. The tension that had once filled the spaces between family members began to ease, not because all wounds had magically healed, but because something more fundamental had shifted, the recognition that my life, my choices, and my voice mattered. I no longer felt like a shadow lurking on the edges of their lives, but as a woman who had stepped fully into her own light, even if it was not always warmly received. The process of healing was uneven and delicate, marked by moments of connection and distance, hope and doubt. Yet through it all, I found a calmness that I had not known for many years, a quiet peace born of acceptance and strength. At home in my modest condo, the familiar routines became anchors in a sea of change. I cherished the mornings when the sun filtered gently through the curtains and I could sit with a cup of tea, the world slow and still. I wrote in my journal, filling pages with thoughts and reflections, not just about pain and loss, but about resilience and gratitude. The simple act of putting words to paper was a balm, a way to order the swirling emotions and to remind myself of the journey I had traveled. Each sentence was a stitch in the fabric of a new narrative, one where I was no longer a passive character, but the author of my own story. One afternoon, I found myself going through an old box of photographs, a collection of memories from years past. Among the faded images was a picture of me in my 30s, standing by the ocean with the sun setting behind me, a smile lighting up my face. I held the photograph gently, feeling the warmth of that moment, the promise of a life still full of possibilities. I decided to frame it and place it by the window, a reminder of who I had been and who I still was beneath the layers of time and experience. It was a symbol of continuity and hope, a quiet declaration that the woman in the photo and the woman I had become were one and the same. The granddaughter's letter had been the first tentative step toward mending a fractured relationship, and while the path was far from straightforward, there were moments that hinted at renewal. We exchanged letters slowly, carefully, each one a bridge across the distance that had grown between us. She wrote of her own struggles and fears, and I shared memories and wisdom gleaned from a lifetime of living. It was not a perfect connection, but it was genuine, and that was enough. I learned that love, especially between generations, is a work in progress, requiring patience, understanding, and the willingness to forgive. Not just others, but ourselves as well. My daughter and I found a new way of relating too. The conversations that once felt weighted with expectation and frustration became more open and honest. We acknowledged the difficulties and misunderstandings that had marked our past, and we began to build a future based on mutual respect and care. It was a slow process, sometimes punctuated by setbacks, but always moving forward. I understood that family is not a static entity, but a living, evolving relationship that requires nurturing and grace. Through it all, I held on to the lessons learned in the quiet moments of reflection and resilience. I had discovered that true strength is not about loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but about the courage to face each day with integrity and grace. It is the strength to set boundaries, to ask for respect, and to embrace one's own worth even when others fail to recognize it. It is the ability to forgive without forgetting, to love without losing oneself, and to find peace in the midst of imperfection. I often think of the women I have met along the way, the friends from the women's group who share their stories of hardship and triumph. Their voices echo in my heart, a chorus of resilience that reminds me I am not alone. We are sisters in the journey, bound by the shared experience of invisibility and the fierce determination to be seen. To them and to all women who have felt pushed aside or forgotten, I offer this message. You are worthy of love and respect. Your story matters, and it is never too late to reclaim your voice. As I sit by the window, watching the light shift and dance across the room, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for the past that shaped me, for the challenges that tested me, and for the strength that sustained me, for the family that is imperfect but beloved, and for the life that continues to unfold with all its complexities and surprises. The laughter by the pool, once a source of pain, has transformed in my memory into a catalyst for growth, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is the possibility of light. I am still here. I am still whole. And I'm still writing the story of my life. Not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman who has learned to stand tall, to speak clearly, and to love deeply. This is my truth, my legacy, and my gift to the next chapter.